documents, ti@mail.house.gov. Now I recognize myself for the purpose of opening statement for 5 minutes. We meet here today to examine threats of emerging challenges to maritime commerce in and around the Red Sea shipping corridor. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. We appreciate them. Bud Darr, Executive Vice President of Maritime Policy and Government Affairs at MSC Group. Ian Rawlby, CEO of LR Consilium. Jonathan Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy and Retail Federation, and David Heindel, President of Seafarers International Union. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Look forward to your testimony and what you got to say. Red Sea is critical as shipping corridor for global maritime commerce, connecting Europe and Asia, and Suez Canal representing nearly 20% of container traffic and a significant portion of oil and liquefied natural gas shipments. Since October, Houthis and Iranian-backed separatist group based in Yemen have sought to disrupt global commerce by significantly increasing attacks against military and civilian vessels transiting the Red Sea. To date, dozens of vessels have been targeted either through hijacking, attempted hijacking, or missile or drone strikes, putting ships and their crews at risk. Sadly, we learned last week that 2 Navy SEALs were lost at sea during a mission to disrupt Iranian arms shipments to the Houthis. Our prayers go out to their families for the fallen SEALs and all service members still in the region. In response to these threats, we have seen carriers reroute ships around Africa, insurance costs skyrocketing, leading to increased container rates and longer transit times for goods to arrive at their destinations. On December 18th, the United States announced an establishment of Operation Prosperity Guardian, multinational security initiative to support maritime commerce transiting through the Red Sea. And on January 12th, the United States Navy, in conjunction with coalition partners, began airstrikes in an effort to degrade the Houthis' ability to strike maritime targets. At the same time, these disruptions are occurring in the Red Sea. The Panama Canal is also facing bottlenecks as low water levels are forcing canal authorities to reduce transits by half, compounding uncertainty for ocean carriers and shippers. We saw firsthand during the pandemic what a significant supply chain crisis can do to global economy, and we must not let that happen again. And so I thank our witnesses for joining us today and look forward to hearing what they have done to address these challenges. So now I recognize the ranking member to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Webster and Ranking Member Carbajal, for holding this hearing on the ongoing Houthi attacks on commercial shipping. I look forward to learning about the status of the domestic and international supply chains, as well as the U.S. and the international response. Now, 90% of goods moved worldwide spend time on a ship. As a country that depends on maritime trade, the U.S. has to do what it needs to do to ensure resilient supply chains. For its part, the U.S. Navy continues to do an exceptional job to ensure free and open maritime trade around the world. I was on this committee when, in 2009, pirates captured the U.S.-flagged Menace, Alabama, off the coast of Somalia, and the Navy ensured the safe return of the vessel and every mariner on board. Unfortunately, a new threat exists: a continuous and unpredictable Houthi attack on commercial vessels transiting the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. I do want to take a moment to formally recognize the work of the Navy, which is playing a leading role in Operation Prosperity Guardian, and with partner nations is regularly thwarting Houthi attacks. As a result, ships continue to transit the region daily. I am saddened, though, by the death of 2 Navy SEALs who perished during an operation to seize Iranian weapons bound for Yemen's Houthi rebels. Special Warfare Operator First Class Christopher J. Chambers and Special Warfare Operator Second Class Nathan Gage Ingram died, protecting American sovereignty, and their sacrifice kept deadly weapons out of the hands of terrorists. However, the threat posed by Houthi rebels persists. To avoid this challenge, some operators have diverted their vessels around the Horn of Africa, adding 10 to 12 days to the trip, increasing carbon emissions, and $1 million in operating costs to their voyages. Those who do transit the Red Sea face significant increases in their insurance premiums or risk being dropped altogether. In either case, the end result is higher prices for U.S. consumers. And over the past 4 years, the global supply chain has been tested in ways previously unimaginable. From the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea to historic drought conditions at the Panama Canal to COVID-19 related backlogs, one thing is clear: smooth sailing on the high seas should not be taken for granted. Congress responded to the COVID-19 supply chain crisis in several ways. As an example, Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which, among other things, invests $2.25 billion in the Port Infrastructure Development Program. That investment will help ensure that ports are prepared for inevitable fluctuations in cargo that jeopardize the seamless movement of goods. Congress passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, a bipartisan bill which ensures fair and transparent policies and practices associated with international shipping. And in 2009, in the wake of the piracy attack on the Menace, Alabama, this subcommittee took immediate action by holding hearings and coordinated a comprehensive federal response to ensure the protection of U.S. ships and U.S. mariners. That response involved the Department of Transportation, Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Commerce, and the U.S. Coast Guard. The result was the immediate protection of U.S. flagged ships, as well as a coordinated international effort to apprehend and prosecute pirates and associated criminal organizations. This time, even more is needed. The Houthi threat requires an international response that goes beyond a justified response in attacking Houthi aggression. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Walby about the need to empower Yemen to combat the threat internally. Just as the U.S. should continue to stand by Ukraine, we have to support our friends around the world. Their security and sovereignty is our security and sovereignty. And while we can't control the rain in Panama immediately, Congress can ensure that infrastructure here at home works. That means continued investments in roads, rail, airports, ports, vessels, and the women and men that make our transportation system work. It's not too soon to start considering what that next investment in infrastructure will look like, as well as the investment in the U.S. maritime industry. So I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure the investments that started in the BIL are continued. I would just note as well that we have the responsibility in this committee, the subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, to look at the supply chain issues with regards to shipping around the world and shipping in the U.S. And that's the focus of this hearing. And I do want to thank the chair and the ranking member for calling it. With that, I look forward to hearing the witnesses and yield back.
Thank you, recommended ranking member Larson. Now I recognize ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Carbajal. You recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster. Today's hearing is timely so we can better understand the ongoing situation in the Red Sea and the effect it has on the global economy. About 12% or 1 trillion of global trade passes through the Red Sea every year. Ship operators have scrambled to account for the increased risk by taking extreme measures such as diverting vessels, paying increased insurance costs, hiring private security, and relying on the United States Navy-led Operation Prosperity Guardian for the protection in the region. The U.S. and global economy will be affected by this crisis in the Red Sea. The only question is how much. I look forward to learning more about the commercial and economic impacts, but I would like to use the rest of my time to focus on the human factor. Life on a ship is not glamorous. Mariners are typically at sea for several months at a time. They have limited access to internet and their families, and they are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The foreign mariners on foreign ships is worse. They're often required to work a year or more at a time, are paid unfair wages, and are often subjected to subpar health conditions and legal systems. Unfortunately, that's the result of the flag of convenience system where ship owners can register their vessels in low tax, let me repeat that, low tax, low regulation countries and find mariners from anywhere in the world, so as long as they'll tolerate the wages. For all mariners, though, the Houthi threat in the Red Sea is real. The U.S. Navy is doing incredible work protecting lives and commerce, but living, sleeping, and working under constant threat of deadly attack is unacceptable and unsustainable. Unfortunately, this is business as usual for American mariners. Through every emergency, conflict, and war, the United States Merchant Marine has shown up. They bravely sailed during World War II when ships were being sunk daily by torpedoes, many lives lost. They delivered military supplies to our troops during the Gulf War when foreign mariners and foreign companies refused. They routinely sail hospital ships to disaster-stricken regions. Currently, American mariners are showing their bravery and dedication by sailing through the Red Sea to deliver military cargo and humanitarian aid to the region. Congress must find new and innovative ways to bolster the U.S. Merchant Marine. I'll close by expressing my appreciation for the U.S. Navy. Without them, vessel traffic in the Red Sea would come to a halt in November. I'd also like to remember the 2 Navy SEALs who died during an operation in the Arabian Sea to intercept the delivery of Iranian weapons to Houthi terrorists. They are heroes, and their sacrifice protected countless military and civilian lives. Thank you, Chair, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
I'd like to again welcome our witnesses. Appreciate you being here. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to the witnesses. There are 3 lights found in front of you. Green means go, yellow means time to slow down, and red means conclude your remarks. I also ask unanimous consent that the witness' full statement be included in the record. Without objection, show that ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record today's hearing remain open until such time as the witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, show that it ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, show that ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the committee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Mr. Dar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster. Thank you, Ranking Members Larson and Carbajal, and members for the opportunity to be here today and help describe what our experience has been to date and perhaps shed a little light on what the future may look like with this situation. I have provided a written statement. I provided my CV. I will not bore you with too much detail on that, other than to say I'm a graduate of the United States Merchant Marine Academy proudly. I served in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard until retirement, and I am an American citizen, and I feel very strongly about the interest that the United States has in these issues, whether it involves U.S. flagships, U.S. mariners, or other seafarers just trying to do their jobs every day. I'd like to offer up some comments on 4 points that I'd like to ask your attention to. One is that this is an unprecedented series of attacks by non-state actors upon commercial shipping. There have certainly been attacks in the past, either by states that were well organized, and there have been attacks by non-state actors, such as Somali piracy some time ago, which seems unfortunately to be reemerging now at this moment. But as non-state actors go, the level of sophistication of the targeting, the weaponry, and the boldness is absolutely unprecedented. And they have, in fact, taken control of a vital sea lane, which is essential not only for U.S. economic interests, but for trade to flow more broadly throughout the world. I'll point out what we do in our industry is we are a conduit for trade. We don't operate ships just to operate them, although we love them very much and we love the people that operate them. We go where the trade requires us to go, and we will adapt accordingly. I'd also like to offer my express thanks not only to the U.S. Navy, who not only has fought so bravely, sometimes paying the ultimate cost during this particular conflict, but also for keeping the watch over the holidays. I remember many conference calls with CENTCOM where we were at home with our families and they were not. And we are grateful for the contributions that are being made, even if today we are not seeing a genuine improvement on the water to the point where we feel that it is safe. So my second point is we're making this work. It is an extraordinary, unprecedented situation. It is extremely complicated, particularly to adapt global networks quickly, but we are making it work. Commerce is flowing. The third point is these are interconnected systems when you look at any one carrier or you look at a sector, such as the containerized sector, which is the part of our business I'm here to speak to you about today. You can't look at one particular port or one particular service loop, which would be a series of ports served by a series of vessels, but you have to look at how it fits in with the broader system, particularly where it interfaces with ports and interfaces with the shoreside component of what it takes to keep supply chains moving. And one major difference between the situation we faced during the pandemic, which was also quite difficult, and what we face today is that those shoreside components are not showing the incredible stress that they were under during the pandemic, where it became painfully obvious to us that we could still operate ships quite well. We hadn't forgotten how to do that, but the shoreside component of what we would do once we got to port in the US was not capable of handling that sort of a surge. And that's where I think these investments in the future are critically important so that we have a more capable and more resilient series of supply chains components for the future in the interest of the United States. I will also say there are substantial costs that come with these alterations. Some of the comments in the opening statement, I think, made recognition of that. And we are still trying to assess the full scope of those costs. At this moment, quite honestly, you have to make a best educated guess that you can, because it's not the same from company to company, it's not the same from service to service, it's not the same from loop to loop, and it's even not exactly the same from ship to ship. But keep in mind, if we need additional ships of a certain type or other equipment to fulfill the surge need, that has to come probably from other service areas, so it causes disruption throughout the whole interconnected network. I believe that situation will normalize. I believe we're in this for a while, at least it feels like that way. And as that happens, I think the market will take over again and pricing will reflect equity from carrier to carrier, customer to customer over time as the market normally can do. And the last point I'll make, sir, is about seafarers. At the end of the day, the controlling consideration here and the controlling point of what the discussion should be, in my humble opinion, has to be about the human aspect of this. I work for a family-owned company. We have almost 200,000 employees, and I can tell you our chairman views them all as family members. It is unique for us, but it shouldn't be. These seafarers are keeping commerce moving, they're serving global society's needs, and they are just trying to do their job every day. And for them to be shot at, as they were 3 different times on our fleet, one of which was an hour-long firefight that they were directly in the middle of, is just unacceptable. We've got to find a way to make the shooting stop. And for all the other considerations we have here, I would urge, let's keep in mind there are real human lives hanging in the balance of the decisions that we make, and they cannot just be commercial decisions, because we can insure a ship, we can insure a cargo, or our customers can, but you can never properly insure the impact of a loss of human life. Thank you.
Dr. Rowley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Carbajal, members, I'm Ian Ralby, and I appreciate this opportunity to share with you some of the maritime security aspects of this menace in the Red Sea. And it is indeed a menace. Based on my analysis and that of my team at IR Concilium, I want to make 3 points. First, even if the Israel-Gaza situation ended today with a complete resolution that was mutually agreeable to all parties involved, the Houthis would continue to attack shipping. Second, 100% of the ballistic missile capabilities of the Houthis could be taken out, and the Houthis would still attack shipping. And number 3, if the US continues to be the face of the counter-Houthi narrative and the counter-Houthi operations, others will continue to be inspired to join the Houthis and potentially could join them in attacking shipping as well. Since the 19th of November, the Houthis have seized on a convenient narrative that played into something that they wanted. They have opportunistically taken advantage of the Palestinian situation and made it a cause that aligned with their own interests, albeit hypocritically so. If we look at that hypocrisy, the Houthis have, over the last 10 years, killed more Muslim Arabs than Israel has in 75 years of its existence. The Houthis do not care about the Palestinian cause except insofar as it furthers them. Furthermore, they are protesting that situation by targeting innocent civilians. And that hypocrisy needs to be pointed out. By not having divorced the narrative between what is happening in Israel and Gaza and what is happening on the Red Sea, we have allowed the Houthis to gain momentum, gain new members, and to inspire others as being a party that is doing something it really isn't. They are looking out for their own interests, and they are loving this situation for the momentum it has given them. Unfortunately, they are also loving the fact that we have bombed them now. For 10 years, they've been spouting the narrative that they were at war with the US and the UK, and that was one of the ways that they motivated people, and particularly brainwashed some of the youth in Yemen, to join their cause. Now, the whole world's media is telling them that they are actually at war with the US and the UK. And so we've given them inadvertently credibility, and that credibility has given them relevance, it's given them visibility, and they love the taste of the significance that they now seem to have. So they are going to continue looking for ways to attack. And so even if we take out 100% of their capabilities on the ballistic front and on the drone front, they will find other ways to be continually attacking shipping, as we've learned from other piracy incidents in other parts of the world, from Somalia to the Singapore Strait to the Gulf of Guinea and beyond. It doesn't take very much to be able to disrupt maritime commerce. And they have certainly the will to do so, and have in the past tested the use of remote control bomb boats and even found unmanned underwater systems that have been capable of potentially attacking shipping as well. So now the world is watching, and the Houthis are enjoying it, but we have to be very careful, because if we do not change how we are approaching the Houthis, we're going to continue to inadvertently embolden them. They have an incredibly low regard for human life. They have shown that over and over. They have weaponized food for their own people. They have killed, as I said, more people over the course of the conflict than died in the entire conflict in Afghanistan over 20 years. They are not to be treated as a rational party in the way we see rational thinking. And so we must suspend our own approach for what we think would be the right way forward to look at how to deal with the enemy that we actually face, not the one that we want. We have to pull their attention away from shipping, and in order to do that, we have to also embolden the government of Yemen. The government of Yemen holds the keys to this situation. Without them taking up and fighting to regain their own sovereignty, we are setting ourselves up for a long-term problem. At the moment, the Houthis are a threat to the people of Yemen, they are a threat to the region, they are a threat to global shipping, they are a threat to the entire global commerce, and as a result, they are a threat to the United States public. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gold, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Carbajal, for the invitation to testify today on behalf of the National Retail Federation on the impacts of Red Sea shipping disruptions. Retail is the nation's largest private sector employer, contributing $3.9 trillion to the annual GDP and supporting 1 in 4 U.S. jobs. That's 52 million working Americans. Having a safe, efficient, predictable, and timely supply chain is critical to the success of any retailer to ensure that products are available to the consumer, whether they shop online or in store. We all saw firsthand the disruption caused when supply chains were completely overwhelmed during the pandemic. Through significant efforts, supply chains were returning to normal and congestion issues were resolved. We are now faced with another significant supply chain disruption because of the attacks in the Red Sea. This is on top of the restrictions impacting the Panama Canal, as was mentioned by the members. While the volume of U.S. trade through the Suez Canal is small, the disruption impacts are being felt far and wide. The biggest challenges for retailers are the additional volatility, cost, uncertainty, and overall risk to the supply chain. Retailers are being forced to readjust their supply chains to ensure product delivery. Our members are seeing increased time, additional 10 to 14 days or longer to the supply chains to compensate for longer vessel sailing times around the Cape of Good Hope. Our members are also seeing an increase in shipping costs. There's been a significant increase in freight rates on the spot market. While not as high as during the pandemic, there are concerns about what this means for future contract rates. Carriers are also seeking a number of different surcharges and fees, including war risk surcharges, emergency contingency surcharges, and others. We understand that longer vessel times impact fuel, labor costs, and insurance costs. Our members want to make sure these fees and surcharges cover real costs and are not intended for profit. One member has told me that they have had carriers ask for an increase of $1,500 to $3,000 per container, which represents a 38% to 73% cost increase for directly affected cargo. We're also hearing that the rates and surcharges are not just being applied to directly impacted cargo, but to other routes such as the EU to US route because of equipment availability. Some members are also noting that their overseas vendors are starting to see some challenges with their ability to source raw materials in a timely manner, as well as increased costs for those components. Retailers are working closely with their supply chain partners to address the disruptions and to implement mitigation strategies. It is important to note that retailers are making decisions now regarding back-to-school and holiday shipments. Some of these strategies include transiting the Cape of Good Hope, as talked about. For cargo and vessels waiting to transit the Red Sea, the carriers have made the decision to shift around the Cape of Good Hope. NRF members have to rely on the decision of the carrier, but then address the delayed transportation issues once the cargo arrives in the U.S. Our members are also indicating that they are shifting supply chains back to utilizing West Coast ports and then using intermodal rail to get the cargo back to the East Coast. Unfortunately, the Panama Canal is not a viable option right now. Some retailers are shifting their cargo from more sensitive to air cargo for more timely and sensitive shipments. In addition, retailers are working with their overseas vendors to encourage early shipments to avoid disruptions. While many are focusing on the current situation, more challenges will be created the longer these disruptions continue. The federal government needs to start paying attention to these issues now to help avoid significant congestion in the coming months. We are now entering the new cycle for new ocean contract negotiations. Retailers are concerned about what the impact of long-term disruptions will have on this next contract. We do not want to see rates similar to the pandemic, which could impact inflation. Shippers are also looking to shift back to the West Coast ports. We know a significant amount of cargo had shifted away because of the pandemic and the most recent labor negotiations. We need to make sure that our ports, terminals, railroads, harbor drayage providers, and warehouses are ready for the increased cargo volumes that will shift back. Rail car imbalances and increased demand could result in more congestion and increases in dwell. We're already hearing that the dwell time is starting to tick up on the rail side. We need to make sure we have an available fleet of chassis and readily available terminal appointments to be able to move containers out of the terminals as quickly as possible. Some believe this congestion could begin within the next 4 to 6 weeks, so we need to convene stakeholders now to plan. There are also concerns that vessels and equipment will be out of position, including empty containers, because of the longer sailing times. Vessel space is becoming increasingly constrained, which may impact replenishment for spring and summer merchandise. Some carriers are canceling certain services, which will create additional capacity constraints in the market. While the focus of today's hearing is on the Red Sea disruptions, it is important to note that other supply chain challenges will further complicate the global supply chain. The ripple effects will impact other issues. I already noted the Panama Canal restrictions. As retailers are looking to address these issues, they're also planning for potential labor disruptions at East Coast and Gulf Coast ports because of the current labor negotiations between the ILA and USMX. The contract expires at the end of September during the peak shipping season when retailers are bringing in their holiday merchandise. Retailers are making their shipping decisions now to avoid any potential issues. In conclusion, the challenges from the ongoing attacks in the Red Sea are significant and will get worse the longer they occur. We appreciate the attention and actions of the administration with Operation Prosperity Guardian in building an international coalition. More work, though, needs to go into efforts to ensure safe passage for vessels and mariners through the Red Sea. Their safety is of the utmost importance. While we're addressing the immediate issues, we need to make sure that we are preparing for the potential congestion issues that will impact U.S. ports in the coming months. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Mr. Heindel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, and the members of the committee for letting me testify today. I am representing the interest of the seafarers unions, not only domestically but internationally as well, with regards to this menace that we're all experiencing. We represent the crews here in the States of the U.S. flag vessels that have been attacked in the Red Sea. These attacks in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait have disrupted international commerce and represent the greatest threat to the merchant marine since World War II. The men and women of the merchant marine are no strangers to armed conflict. Throughout our history, we have battled privateers, commerce raiders, mines, submarines, pirates, and terrorists. These attacks have highlighted what every mariner knows. Our jobs are essential, they are dangerous, and may require us to sail into harm's way. The Red Sea attacks represent the most technologically advanced threat we've ever faced. drones, anti-ship cruise missiles, and anti-ship ballistic missiles have all targeted American and foreign ships and their crews. I want to thank the President, the Secretary of Defense, TRANSCOM, CENTCOM, NAVCENT, and the other military components, as well as the Maritime Administration for their efforts on our behalf. And it is thanks to them that we have managed to avoid casualties so far. These attacks have had a major impact on the global supply chain. The Red Sea accounts for as much as 25% of the world's container shipping trade. We have seen a 70% reduction in ship transits and a 50% reduction in cargo through the region. Several carriers, both international and U.S. flag, have chosen to divert their vessels away from the Red Sea and instead make the trip around the Cape of Good Hope to avoid this menace. This adds nearly 2 weeks to a typical voyage each way. If these attacks continue, the impact will have an effect on our economy and potentially add to a rise in prices of consumer goods. It is critical for our economic interests that this shipping route remain open. As of today, we have not had any difficulty in crewing ships headed through the warlike area, and no ship has sailed late because of crew issues. It is our goal that every American ship that has been called upon sails on time with a full complement. It's important to note that our ships are not combat vessels, and they are not capable of defending themselves against these kinds of attacks. We're wholly reliant on naval support. We have been coordinating with TRANSCOM, MARAD, and the MSC at a variety of levels to ensure the safe passage through these areas. Our biggest need right now is secure communications, whether this is in the form of specialized equipment, naval liaisons embedded on board our ships, or additional American civilian mariners with proper clearances and certificates on board having direct communications between our ships and combat ships in the area. It's key. We have been informed by the Military Sealift Command that they will be sending additional personnel to the 5th Fleet NAVCENT Maritime Operations Center, and we hope this enhances the flow of information between our ships and their defenders in the region. I am convinced that our mariners would prefer to only enter the region when it is absolutely necessary and any non-essential voyages be rerouted. Having a reliable, dependable, and loyal maritime transportation system is critical to American national security. Programs like the Maritime Security Program, Tanker Security Program, Cargo Preference, and the Jones Act create and maintain jobs in peacetime so that the ships, their crews, are available when called upon by the government. Every American ship attacked so far has either been enrolled in the MSP or is a government-owned vessel crewed by civilian mariners. Finally, maritime labor is very concerned about how much information is publicly available about these attacks. Thanks to social media, we've seen information like ships' locations, registration data, vessel schedules, speed, routes, and destinations posted on the internet and made available in almost real time. The level of detail being provided is far beyond that needed to convey the message that American ships need protection. This is an actionable intelligence for the Houthis should they choose to use it. We have learned the hard way in the past conflicts that loose lips do sink ships, and we need to make sure that this vital seaway is kept open to keep commerce moving. We merchant mariners are proud of our 250-year history of service, and we have delivered the goods in peace and war, and we will continue to do so. I would like to thank you for holding this hearing, and I am happy to answer any question that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and we'll now turn to questions from the panel. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Dar, during the pandemic, we saw a clear impact on the supply chain and disruptions of the global economy. Can you share could you share if there have been any lessons learned from that we might use now? And if so, how would they be implemented to prevent future situations this time around?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to answer that question. I have to say that the fundamental problems that we saw, particularly in the United States, really can be traced back to much more of the shoreside component, and I think addressing both the infrastructure and operational practices there can help insulate us for future crises, whether it be one of this scale or one of a different scale like the pandemic was. So I would emphasize a focus on fixing that part, because that was essentially what failed us all as consumers and also companies trying to serve the economy. When it comes to application to this particular situation, I would say it taught us to expect the unexpected and not think you really can predict what's coming next, be as nimble as possible, and it's forced us to maintain some additional capacity at substantial cost to be able to respond. And if we did not have that additional capacity at hand right now, as we do under the current market conditions, I would argue we probably would be in a much, much more difficult situation than we are. The reality is, because we have kept that additional capacity available, we've been able to deploy it, and although it takes longer, and although it has some additional costs associated with it, we're making it work, and the goods are moving.
Mr. Rabi, Dr. Rabi, simply put, what objectives do you think the Houthis movement is hoping to achieve by perpetrating these attacks?
Thank you, Chairman. Their main objective is to advance their own movement. Their movement includes goals to not only take over the remainder of Yemen, but to advance on both Mecca and ultimately Jerusalem. They see this as a global movement. Theologically, the Houthis began with a certain interpretation of how the world should be ordered. They have no real interest in governing. They just have an interest in advancing that ideology. And interestingly, that ideology is actually at odds with Iran. The Iranian and Houthi ideology do not line up. So at some point, they will find themselves at odds with each other. But for now, their interests are aligned because the Houthis are willing to be as erratic and chaotic as they are in pursuing both advancement on Yemen and ultimately advancement on more of the region. So they're merchants of chaos. They really enjoy being chaotic. And so for right now, that is serving their purpose.
Can you share with the subcommittee some of the risks currently incurred by American-owned flagged maritime assets transiting the Red Sea, as well as any other potential ones of concern emerging from the Houthis' increased aggression?
Certainly. I think since we began striking targets within Yemen, there has been a major increase in the direct attempt to target U.S. affiliated ships, because U.S. flagships are obvious, but there are also different layers of ownership and connection to the United States that have led to the Houthis targeting them more. Interestingly, it appears that some of that targeting is being aided and provided by Iran, who are much more capable in discerning the overall character of vessels. They've proven themselves over the years to be very competent in identifying a specific entity attached to a vessel and targeting that entity as their interlocutor and using their attacks. The Houthis don't care that much, but they're enjoying the fact that they can target U.S. ships right now. The problem is that they are erratic, as I said, but also they don't care if they get it wrong. So as much as they may be targeting one nationality of ship, they're likely indifferent as to whether they actually hit it, as long as it gets some attention, and they're also indifferent as to whether they hit something else or someone else. And so this is a grave threat to all shipping, but certainly at the moment, the increase in attention on the U.S. and U.K. vessels has been problematic.
Thank you very much. Looks like my time's out. So, Mr. Carbajal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield to our ranking member, Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Carwell. Mr. Heindel, your statement warns that loose lips sink ships. Can you underscore a little bit more how concerned maritime labor is about the availability of vessel movement information, which I can get on my phone right now, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's been quite a bit. Obviously, it's very hot news today. The media is all covering it, and specifically the maritime media is covering it very heavily. And if you happen to look at some of the issues, and it's practically daily, that are, or I should say coverage that they're putting out there, it is showing vessels where they are, and they're tracking these vessels. It's almost like, as I said, real time. Now, perhaps it may be a few hours old, it may be a day old, but the fact is that if the media is covering it to such a degree and putting this information out there, it's not healthy. It's not healthy for our mariners. It's not healthy for the vessels that we're sailing on. It's important that I think it be said that you don't have to have all of the details and the photos that they're putting out there in their journals or blogs, if you will.
Well, I think the men and women in the maritime labor are an important part of the supply chain. I didn't check my tags on my clothes this morning, but I imagine a few of these were not made in the U.S. and were brought in containers on a few ships that traveled around the world. I'm not sure from where to where, but I'm sure if we all checked our clothing, we'd find that we're connected to this problem a little bit more closely ourselves than we all realize. But you're all on the front line, and I appreciate what you're doing out there to help us out. Mr. Dar, while the Navy's doing a great job actually, maintaining a minimum level of safety currently in the Red Sea, are there other things the U.S. can be doing to prepare for supply chain disruptions in the future? Keeping in mind, I said in my opening, we're the Coast Guard Maritime Transportation Subcommittee, so our focus is largely on the supply chain side of things, the economic side of things. Can you address what we can do to prepare for supply chain disruptions in the future?
Thank you, sir. And when it comes to your original comment about how closely connected we all are, I think that's very true, and I would urge everyone to think about that, because, again, we are a conduit for world trade, and we work best and we serve our customers' needs the best and ultimately the consumers best when supply chains are functioning in an integrated way. So I would suggest infrastructure investments in the physical infrastructure, changing some of the operational constraints on maintaining inventory so there's more of a surge capacity, including impacts that it may have on warehousing and shipping capability and things like that. Find the right balance between regulating what needs to be regulated, say on the environmental side and the safety side, against the practical needs of keeping goods moving. It's not an easy thing to do, but that pragmatism is required in order to keep things functioning. From the Navy standpoint, of course, keeping the sea lanes open. I think it was my third day in Navy boot camp when I was a very impressionable 18-year-old when I was taught that was one of our fundamental missions. And I think worldwide, whether it's the Red Sea, Strait of Malacca, doesn't matter. I think that's an essential part of it to keep commerce flowing. But what's happening today with the kinetic responses to the activity there, that's treating a symptom. And I think that ultimately to keep sea lanes peaceful and open requires a strong element of diplomacy that maybe we shouldn't expect to shoulder on behalf of the United States Navy or other navies, but rather the diplomats and government leaders that support that.
In your testimony, I just want to clarify one thing as well, that you said during COVID, we had the backups at the ports, but things could get there. And this is sort of the opposite. Things are having trouble getting to the ports because of the attacks, but our ports largely are resilient, more resilient than they had been during COVID. Did I get that right?
There is extra capacity available. Our operations people advise me on the terminals we call, they're operating at about 60% capacity right now, and a terminal's optimized at around 80% or so. During the pandemic, we saw numbers like 115, 120%. So that surge capacity to absorb this is available at the moment, but we shouldn't take that for granted. And there will be some times, because of the modification of the services, where we will get large volumes arriving at once, and those need to be dealt with. But I think those will be transient situations where it was a rather long haul during COVID.
Yield back.
Mr. Bevin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you witnesses coming forward in this very, very serious development. Well, we've heard the numbers, 20% of all container shipping, 10% of seaborne oil, 8% of LNG passed through the Suez Canal, a dramatic increase in attacks since October of 23, and quite frankly, I don't know if this is sustainable. Many companies have ceased transits through the Red Sea, increases in risk, insurance premiums, transit times, fuel costs, et cetera. We've announced, of course, Operation Prosperity Guardian and an international coalition, certainly like that. But throughout October, U.S. Navy destroyers intercepted numerous missiles fired by Houthi forces over the Red Sea, and Houthi air defense also shot down a MQ-9 Reaper. Probably that Reaper came out of my district outside of Houston. And the Houthi forces on November the 19th seized control of a British-owned ship, Japanese flagged, the Galaxy Leader, and after 3 months, still holding that ship and still holding the crew. As a former merchant seaman myself, that greatly disturbs me. We have to protect our merchant mariners' lives as well as our ally merchant mariners. Over and over, we've seen a number of attacks by Houthi fighters firing on U.S. Navy helicopters with small arms, et cetera. Now we've lost 3 U.S. military personnel dead. We got 2 SEALs lost at sea, over 24 American military personnel wounded. I think it's high time that the United States retaliate in a way that will make these folks remember and be aware of what they're playing with, and that is playing with fire. So I would ask Mr. Rowlby, if you would, in your written testimony, you shared some of the downsides of diverting ships around Africa, specifically highlighting a lack of safe harbors and the increased potential for piracy. Somalia's out there. What can carriers do to mitigate some of those risks if our administration doesn't strike back? What is the current alternative?
Thank you, sir. I think, first of all, I would agree that there needs to be retaliation, but retaliation does not necessarily mean giving them exactly what they want, which is a direct confrontation militarily with the United States. So I think we need to retaliate by finding ways that will actually persuade them, and they cannot be persuaded in the ways that we would be persuaded. So we need to look to solutions that will draw their attention away from shipping, and that is a critical piece of this. In order to make shipping more safe, particularly through Somalia, we need to be looking at how to resuscitate some of the lessons we learned 10, 12 years ago, or even longer now, when we were dealing with Somali piracy on a day-to-day basis. We saw 2 attacks yesterday, so this is a real threat. The skills for piracy were not lost over the last decade. They were transferred. A lot of the attacks were actually by Somali pirates against vessels that were engaged in illicit trafficking. And so the skills are still there. The reporting just hasn't been there, and the attacks on vessels engaged in legitimate international maritime commerce haven't been there. But we need to be ready for that possibility. To that, I think we need to take a new look at Best Management Practices 5, the guidance that is given to shippers to harden their vessels and ensure safest operations for averting piracy attacks. We need to ensure that we have a greater familiarity with where there are potential safe harbor options. And as the United States, we could do a lot to try to support African ports in being ready to provide fuel supplies, food supplies, freshwater supplies, other husbandry services to the increased traffic. We've seen an 80% year-on-year increase going around the Cape of Good Hope. That is a major increase. Right. And so that is a critical point.
Yes, sir. I would also remind you that when Somali piracy was at its peak, they seized several Russian vessels. The Russians did not mess around with them. They did not play. And I think that it goes to without saying that hitting back very hard teaches people a lesson. And you know, I'm sure diplomacy is great, but you cannot project weakness, and that is what we've seen with all of the attacks going on and the further threats, and trying to tie it in some form or fashion to the Israeli war. And I dare say that even if the Israeli war were over, we would probably continue to see Houthi attacks in that Red Sea area. Looks like I'm out of time, so Mr. Chairman, I will yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Carbajal, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Heindel, there's no question the Navy's doing an incredible job thwarting the Houthi attacks. How does the treatment of U.S. flagged vessels differ from other ships utilizing flags of convenience? And should the Navy be prioritizing the protection of American-owned, American-flagged, and American-crewed vessels, many of which are carrying defense and humanitarian cargoes?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. In simple terms, I believe they should be. But we do have an obligation as well to support all commerce going through that area. I believe that's the goal. But if there are going to be ships that are queuing up to be escorted through the area, I believe that U.S. flags should be priority. Now, first of all, it's U.S. taxpayer dollar on the line here, and I think it's vitally important that we look to protect our seafarers and help the rest of the world when we can.
Thank you. What's the most important thing that can be done to further protect U.S. vessels and American mariners?
Right now, the important thing is communications. As I indicated earlier, we need better communications between the commercial vessels that are active in the Red Sea and being escorted or waiting to be escorted. And if we have the communications that the Navy has or the Military Sealift Command has, we would be in much better position than we are today. Right now, we're using basically the radio or mobile phones if we're fortunate enough to have the connectivity. But having the communications with the combat vessels is vital. Certainly, the way things are currently in the Red Sea, I believe I've seen a news piece that said there's about 75 minutes between the time the missile is launched to the time it hits its target. So we need very quick communications with the combat vessels.
Thank you. Mr. Gold, I'm glad we were able to work together throughout the pandemic to enact meaningful legislation in the form of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. One thing we learned in that process, though, is what happens when we're relying on a supply chain dominated by foreign interests. What are your members doing to increase the share of cargo that goes on U.S. flagships?
Thank you, Congressman, and we definitely appreciate all of your support throughout the pandemic to get the Ocean Shipping Reform Act put through. I think our members are continuously looking at diversifying their supply chains, whether it's away from China or elsewhere. But it takes time to move their supply chains. And unfortunately, with the ongoing challenges that we see, even though when you go and look to diversify, you're being impacted by something else. So I think, again, retailers are looking to make their shifts, but we've got to have open and stable shipping routes to be able to make sure we can get product to where it needs to go. Unfortunately, we're not able to bring everything back here to make. Folks are looking at, friend-shoring, onshoring, ally shoring, but it takes time to develop those. So they're trying to make sure they're doing what they can to make sure products are getting here when they need to be here for the consumer.
Thank you. Mr. Dar, today we're talking about the appropriate U.S. response to Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Given that MSC doesn't flag a single ship in the United States, doesn't pay United States taxes, and doesn't employ American mariners, how should the U.S. Navy prioritize the protection of MSC ships?
Well, first of all, I will say we do have a large base of operations in the U.S. We're number one in the U.S. market. We do employ a lot of American citizens, including myself, sitting here today, and we do pay taxes where they are due in the United States. But that's not what I came here to talk about today. What I would like to address is your question straight on. And it comes down to we are there to serve the commerce needs of the world's trading partners. And what they need, we will provide. And what they need right now is a very competitive service with other options that are out there. We provide that through a variety of flags. We are based in Switzerland, and our corporate headquarters is there in Switzerland physically, as it has been continuously since 1978, which, by the way, has corporate tax rates that are very close to OECD Pillar 2. And taxation is not the real issue here. And what we would like to see is the trading partners keep the sea lanes open, whether that's the United States or whether a larger burden is shouldered by other trading partners around the world, which I think it should be, including some of the largest that are absent from these operations and these risks right now. They should all do so, because the merchant navies of the world are not capable of keeping the sea lanes open themselves, but they will adapt to whatever the needs are of the customers and the countries that are behind them.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm out of time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Mask, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carbajal, will you engage with me for 1 minute so I can understand something?
Sure.
Just listening to your line of questioning, are you advocating that a non-U.S. flag vessel receive no protection?
No, what I'm saying is that, I appreciate all commerce. It's important when you consider the global trade, the dependence we have. But I think that taxpayers, the United States taxpayers, would want us to prioritize, first and foremost, American tax-paying companies.
Very good. Just thank you for clarifying that. I agree with that. I'd love to see agreement on that issue as it pertains to our southern border and prioritizing Americans first. I think that's something that we should take that same ideology and apply it there, not to conflate the issues, but I think they're similar, and so I was glad to hear you bring it up in that way as it relates to flagged vessels. I want to go to a couple of things that were brought up here. And Mr. Ralby, start with you. You used the term persuaded by as it relates to responses that the U.S. could put forward. And just the first question would go to the Biden administration's policies towards Yemen, taking them off the foreign terrorist organization list. They've received about $3 to $3.5 billion in aid since being taken off. Has that persuaded them not to attack?
Let me clarify, the Houthis are 100% not the government of Yemen. So
Has it persuaded, though, the Houthi, they're Yemeni, correct?
they do not see themselves as Yemeni, no. They are physically occupying territory in Yemen, but the Houthi movement sees itself as temporarily occupying Yemen in advance of a greater attempt to take over. They currently control 30% of the territory of Yemen and 70% of the population. 75% of that population is under the age of 29. So they're revolutionizing a very young population, but they do not see themselves as Yemeni.
And, you know, they may not be the government, but it's always an important question to ask whenever you're looking at our foreign policy is, does our aid, does our foreign policy support what we want out of each individual country? Because kind of going back to what Mr. Carbajal said, it has to represent the American taxpayer, right? And does that $3 to $3.5 billion support what we want out of Yemen in towards a policy terms towards the United States of America? I would say not. Maybe you want to have the argument in that way, but
I would agree that our foreign policy towards Yemen is failing at the moment, in that we have, for several administrations consistently, failed to bolster the Yemen government. We have focused our attention on the Houthis since the outset of the coup in 2015, but we have not provided the wherewithal. In 2018, the U.S. Was part of a major effort to prevent the government of Yemen from retaking the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea coast. That is now a critical strategic failure on our part, because if the government of Yemen controlled that sea access, we would perhaps not be having the same conversation we're having today. And so I agree that we need to rethink our foreign policy towards Yemen, particularly because Yemen has long been the sort of forgotten corner of the Middle East. It's a very sad reality. And so we've not paid enough attention to understanding as well the Houthi mentality, which is why, to the point of Mr. Babin and others, we need to strike back, but our way of striking back has to be geared towards providing benefit to the US public. If we just want to strike back for the sake of striking back, we may find ourselves actually making things worse, and that's unfortunately what seems to be happening right now. The Navy is very good at doing its job and fulfilling its mission, but that mission right now that it's been set on is unfortunately backfiring with regard to protecting shipping, protecting seafarers, and making commerce free-flowing.
I don't agree with liberal mentality like that. We're Americans. If somebody hits us, there's going to be a reckoning and we're going to hit back. And that's just the American way, and it should always be the American way, flat out. I want to go to some different questions at this point. I want to talk about range, armaments, reconnaissance, maneuverability, quantity, capabilities. This is advanced in terms of these drone systems throughout not just conflict between United States of America and vessels, but we saw this going on with Saudi Arabia and Houthis and the conflicts that have taken place there. Are we dealing for the vessels with strictly radio or line of sight? Or do you have another capability with which you are able to track the inbound drone strikes?
Generally speaking, what the military operators have said is to use some established lines of communication via CENTCOM or through UKMTO secondarily, and that the first should come through VHF, which obviously has some downside because everyone listens to VHF 16, including the bad guys, but also that they offer satellite communication options where if you call them, they will pick it up, but that's not a secure line of communication. Then, of course, we have some ability to have awareness of what's going on to the extent that AIS is being used. That sends a signal from other vessels in the area, too. But obviously, the bad guys in the region are not going to have AIS transponders on if they have them at all.
I have many more questions I'd love to ask you guys on armaments and reconnaissance and maneuverability, but my time has ended. I appreciate the increase in time, Mr. Chairman, and I have nothing to yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Garamendi, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you very much for your testimony. The more this testimony has gone on, the more the questions have been asked, the more complex the situation is revealed. I'm going to go to Mr. Ralby. You have opined that we're not on the proper path towards a solution. Could you define how we might find a solution and what it might be?
Yes, I certainly agree that when the U.S. gets hit, we hit back. But what we have to be looking at is what we want to accomplish with that. And the way that we hit back has to be similar to what we've looked at even with Ukraine. Russia posed a real threat to the United States. It always has for the last century. And our approach to supporting Ukraine has been empowering the Ukrainians to fight for their own sovereignty as they've been attacked. Similarly, we need to look at the Yemen people and give them the encouragement and the backing to actually fight for their own sovereignty. And that fight is multifold. Yes, it may be kinetic, but at the moment, they also need to be recognized. The fact that there is still confusion in critical circles around the world as to whether the Houthis are the government of Yemen or not is part of the problem. We do not understand Yemen, and so a starting point needs to be there. That then needs to also come with our help in divorcing the narrative between what's happening in Israel and Gaza and what's now happening in the Red Sea. Otherwise, we are not protecting shipping, and we're not protecting U.S. interests, because they will continue to attack. And we have to provide that divorce of the narrative in order to help embolden some of the neighbors to be willing to speak up. Egypt has been ominously quiet on this subject, though they are losing a huge amount. Their canal revenues are dropping precipitously. Their economy is going to take a major, major hit. And unfortunately, they are not going to eke out even a comment unless we divorce that narrative. We then also need to get better in the information operations space. We have allowed the Houthis to control the narrative, and they are very good at it. Their propaganda machine is really quite impressive for the target audience that they're going to. We're very good at speaking to our people about fighting back, about retaliation. Unfortunately, that doesn't sit with the people that we need to be targeting right now in order to change the situation. So if we want to change that context, we're going to have to change our approach to messaging, to visibility, and as I said, we maybe not the right face for this. We may need to find others to carry the water for us, or at least help
I
us.
think it would be very useful if you were to repeat all of that at least a few more times, so that we might come to a better understanding of what we are faced with. Certainly, we already heard just a moment ago that some of us do not understand the Yemen government and the Houthi, quite different, or the history of Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. So the question really to all of you is, how do we gain the support of the international community in dealing with this problem? And I will also note that this particular onset of attacks coincides with the Israeli-Hamas war, and may not end if that were to end, but nonetheless did begin at that point. So the question to all of you in the next minute or so is, how can we enhance international support for the protection of shipping in the area? I do note that Denmark yesterday sent a air defense vessel into the Red Sea. Perhaps that's a start. So let's start, Mr. Heidel, and then right on down the line. How do we get further or better international support for the protection of shipping in the area?
Well, my first thought is that's above my pay grade, but I think we all have to try to continue to educate our allies in the importance of what's going on. My view is there's a bigger dynamic going on that is not on the surface today. That's my personal opinion. But the fact is that we have to do everything we can to convince our allies that it's important that they participate, because a strong front, I think, will provide for a certain message to go not only to the Houthis, but to the guys across the water from them.
We note quickly that the Somalia pilots was lessened when the international community was strongest. Mr. Gold and Mr. Dar, quickly, well, I think I'm out of time.
I would just say real quick, again, not my area of expertise on how to do that, but I think continuing to talk to our allies about the situation, because again, we are impacting global commerce here, and everybody is being impacted by this. So we need to make sure our allies are fully aware of the situation, not just the impact on the U.S., but the impact on their own markets as well, because we're certainly seeing a significant impact in the European market right now, where they're starting to see some inflationary pressures there.
I'm pushing my time well beyond, but it seems to me that if we're going to be successful here, we need to have a large alliance in place, all that are interested in the shipping in the area. And the comment about Egypt lost revenue is instructive. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Bean, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you. Good morning, T&I. Good morning, witnesses. Welcome. Outside of war, have y'all ever seen, it's a toss-up, anybody can jump in. Outside of war, has it ever been this bad in the Red Sea? Attacks on merchant vessels?
Yes.
To my knowledge of the history, no. And it's in part a sign of the times. The last time there was more conflict that threatened the Red Sea in its entirety, the weaponry used against commercial shipping directly was not as sophisticated.
For you to say it's an hour, your ships, merchant ships, were under attack for a firefight directly an hour. That to me is very scary. What happens if this continues? What happens, Mr. Dar, if this continues? Paint the picture for us.
Well, I'll try and go beyond speculation and just give you my observations of what's happening now and extrapolate it out. We will adapt. We will make it work. We will meet the world's commerce needs. That's what we do. But it may not look like it does today. And what we're learning through the initial 6 weeks of adaptation of our networks is maybe we're going to call different places than we called before. Maybe we're going to shift volumes for transshipment to different hubs than we did before. Maybe we're going to avoid transshipment hubs we used very closely. Maybe we are going to avoid the Suez Canal altogether and all that may come from that as far as stability in the region goes. All of those things are possible. I can't paint exactly the picture, but
Gotcha.
I can assure you we'll meet the need, but it will be more expensive. There will be costs associated with that.
10-4. Dr. Ralby, is it just American and ally ships? Are they attacking Iranian ships? Are they attacking Chinese ships?
They, as I said, are quite erratic. So they're attacking everybody at the moment. They're trying to target U.S. and U.K. and Israeli-affiliated ships, but as I said before, they don't really care. They nearly hit a Russian cargo. They've done a couple of things that show that they are just not all that precise. They're imitating what has been, to your earlier question, a fairly consistent Iranian approach of what we've often termed hybrid aggression when a state actor does it, but this is just a non-state actor engaging in terrorist activity. And so they're using these attacks to send messages, and they don't really care who they hit or what vessel might be affected.
Have we seen other countries like China, have they responded, or other countries saying enough of this, we're not going to put up with it?
Everybody's hurting, let's put it that way. No shipping, no shopping. You do not have free flow of maritime commerce. Everyone on Earth hurts, whether you're on the coast or thousands of miles inland. The problem is that a lot of the states are keeping quiet while we've been willing to go out in the front and try things out. And so China has been ominously quiet on this front, and my guess is that they are looking for ways to do what I was saying before. They have equities in this that are really important to understand. In 2023, China brokered a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Part of that deal was for the Iranians to stop arming the Houthis. In the last few weeks, they have overtly resumed arming the Houthis, as we've seen.
So Iran is the main factor behind the Houthis. Are there other countries? Is China involved in Houthi armament, or any other country other than Iran?
The armament flow goes through a number of countries, and the illicit traffic of arms has been well ingrained so that they have different directional flows that allow them to gain weapons. China has been involved, Iran has been involved, I'm sure Russia has been involved. There are a lot of countries that have been involved in the illicit flow of arms for years. And some of that has gone through Somalia, through Djibouti, and into Yemen. There are two vessels, though, that are really important for the U.S. to pay attention to. Iranian-owned commercial vessels in the southern Red Sea, the MV Bashad and the MV Cyrus, both of which take turns operating as both a floating armory and as an intel source for Iranian support to the Houthis. Those vessels should be very much on our focus of how we would want to retaliate, and thus far
They're not. They're given a hall pass. 20 years ago, whenever it was, I know we had Somali pirates was an issue. That's kind of gone away. Is it true because we finally said enough about this and we started using force? Is that what ended Somali pirates, that type of interaction? Mr. Heidel, you say yes. You're nodding yes. Jump in. Mr. Heidel, is that force? Is that our option here?
Well, if you're trying to equate the two, I think there's the politics are different, at least from my viewpoint. Somali pirates were just a band of thugs that found
But force, you say force, and my time is about to run out. Force is what they deal with, and that's the language they speak. And it bears, Dr. Ralby, this has nothing to do with Israel. Is that correct? That was your testimony. Nothing to do with Israel. They're just using that as the guise. Is that correct?
It was a convenient narrative, and for them, the profit margin is not the motivation as it was for Somali pirates, so the risk-reward calculus for them is very, very different. That's why they are a much more difficult threat.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Colton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Webster. Thank you so much to all of our witnesses today. Apologize for the gravelly voice. I'm not sick. I lost my voice cheering for our beloved Detroit Lions. All grit. We really want to thank you for your testimony. This is an incredibly precarious time in our world and in the Red Sea. While the humanitarian impacts are deeply felt across the globe, constituents back home are also concerned about the deep economic impact that this will have, as they're already struggling with hyperinflation and putting food on the table. I have a series of economic questions about the impacts of this war, and also what we can do about it here in Congress. So my first question is for Mr. Gold. Our economy is still recovering from supply chain shortages that we experienced after the pandemic. With some industries still struggling to access essential components. From our national GDP to increased operating costs for maritime shipping, do you have an estimated cost to our economy if the route through the Red Sea is no longer a viable option?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, we do not have an estimate at this point in time. I think there's so many variables as to what the actual impact would be. I think, as Mr. Dar noted, the supply chain will adjust and will adapt, and I think yet to figure out what those additional costs will be. We are seeing some of those costs that are being passed along now, especially to small and medium-sized enterprises who don't have the ability to negotiate and push those costs off. But again, as we're in new negotiating cycle for new contracts, that's going to be an impact. The impact on congestion at our ports, if that does materialize, is going to have an impact as well. So I think, again, preparing for what's to come is where we need to be doing a lot of focus now. I agree with Mr. Dar that the focus on infrastructure, both on kind of the land side, but also through the gate, is critically important, but also looking at kind of the IT systems as well. I think one of the areas where we kind of failed throughout the pandemic was that communication aspect, which is so critical among supply chain partners. The ability to know what's coming in and when and how it's going to transit through the supply chain is incredibly important. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that progress yet on that aspect of this to be able to plan accordingly.
Thank you. Mr. Dar, you mentioned your hopefulness that Congress's investments in port and landside infrastructure included in the bipartisan infrastructure law will increase capacity and resiliency. Can you talk a little bit more about how some of those investments can help us cope?
Yes, ma'am. Those investments, in large part at the port level, let me give you an example. In the U.S., we are largely constrained by the geography of the ports and the terminals that we have. And so to build a new terminal, while not impossible, is very, very difficult, and they tend to encroach upon other users of that land space. So the more we can do to densify the operations in the terminals and make them more efficient, while also, I should point out, in our company's model, maintaining the workforce, because it can be done, and it can be done effectively because the volumes go up. That's a good start. And being as thoughtful as possible about those sorts of investments in particular, I think helps us the most, because also some of those investments can be done faster than to, say, identify a new site and then all that goes with that. It is a lot that goes with that and building that out. Second, I would say the road infrastructure needs huge work. And the rail operators also need whatever incentivization is there to maintain additional surge capacity to meet the rail networks, because whatever we can put, the rail network needs, because whatever we can put on rail is avoided going on the roads and overstressing that again.
It's all a part of the shipping and transport larger ecosystem. What other suggestions do you have for us in Congress? Obviously, containing the conflict, ending the conflict is a major path to ending or to maintaining this route through the Red Sea. But in the interim, this is a daily problem. What can we do here in Congress to help make sure that we are supporting the industry?
So again, I'll start with maybe what you didn't want me to focus on, but I think it is important. The shooting has to stop. It has to be safe enough for us to send our sons or daughters or people that have trusted their lives to us into that region. When it comes to what we can do day to day, we have what we have, and we have a substantially altered series of networks trying to deliver the cargo. And I would say being as prepared as possible from retail shelving all the way down to the quayside will help us avoid another situation like we had during the pandemic. Yeah. But I want to be very clear. The scale of this disruption comes at a better time when there is additional capacity both at sea and ashore. And second, the scale of the cost excursions, the underlying expenses to us to operate that have to find their way into the market is, to this point, nowhere near what it was during the pandemic. It happened very quickly, right. But if you look at what the analysts are putting out there, we may have seen the top in some of the markets. Not for me to speculate on, but you can review that yourself. And then lastly, that on the export trades are under a lot less stress and price pressure.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the additional time.
Kelly yields back. Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, I'm a little different angle here. I believe President Biden has failed our country. He grossly mishandled our Afghanistan withdrawal. It was a sign of weakness. He didn't prevent Russia's attack on Ukraine when we could have just prevented it. It was a sign of weakness. And he's been unable to prevent Iran-backed proxies from attacking our ally Israel and all of our troops in the Mideast. Again, it's a sign of weakness. None of these horrendously handled events would have ever happened under our previous President Trump. He knew that in order to protect America abroad, the commander-in-chief must be strong. What we need in this country are those great words, peace through strength. Because where there is weakness, there is always war. Just this weekend, 3 of our service members were killed and almost 40 others injured in an Iranian-backed drone attack in Jordan. You're all aware of it. This, again, is a tragedy that President Biden could have prevented, but has failed to do so because he has created an era of weakness around the world. And it's gravely impacting Americans, and it's impacting our American interests. The Houthi terrorist organizations based in Yemen has been launching missile barrages on Israel and have conducted over 30 different attacks on civilian and military vessels. And these are the vessels that transit the Red Sea. Houthi forces are also responsible for seizing the control of the Galaxy Leader, an ally vessel with 25 human beings on board, all of whom are being held captive by the Houthi terrorists. Dr. Ralby, to your knowledge, what is being done to rescue the hostages from the Houthis?
I am not familiar with any negotiations, and I don't think it'd be appropriate to share that in an open forum if I were. Thank you.
Okay, so you have no knowledge of it, and I don't think anybody else does either. What can be done to prevent all of these attacks from happening again and again? Your thoughts, Dr. Ralby.
To prevent the attacks, we have to draw the Houthi attention away from shipping. That has to be the first step. It doesn't mean that they will stop attacking, it doesn't mean they will stop fighting, but they need to not be attacking global maritime commerce and the seafarers who carry our goods. We need to embolden not only the government of Yemen, but as we said before, the neighborhood in order to help make that happen. So American strength in diplomacy and American strength in its military both require that we help our closest friends recognize their own interests as well. At the moment, we have some hope in the immediate horizon with the EU Naval Force mission that is being sent to the region on the 19th of February. The EU is not a military alliance. The EU is not a sovereign nation state in and of itself. And during the piracy days, we learned an important lesson from the EU Naval Force mission. Some of the most hostile nations towards each other, so Russia, China, Iran, India, the United States, others who do not necessarily love to speak to each other or love to work together, found common purpose using the EU as that nameless, faceless economic community in combating an economic threat. And so we may be able to work more closely with some of our partners, with some of the region, if we first divorce the narrative, second, find these kinds of avenues for pulling Houthi attention away, third, embolden and support the government of Yemen and the Yemeni people to retake their sovereignty, and ultimately try to keep the focus on the consequences, not necessarily the actions.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Houthi attacks have also gravely affected, as we all know, that's why you're here, our supply chain. The Red Sea helps facilitate a massive amount of global trade per year, and you all know that as well. And these attacks have forced many of these ships to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, which you also know. And it's making more cargo more expensive, which you also know, and time intensive. This is directly caused by the very same group that our current president declassified as a specially designated global terrorist group over 2 years ago. Again, it's a clear example, in my opinion, of weakness. In that time, this undoubtedly terroristic organization has been able to regroup and put themselves in the position where they can attack, and they are attacking America and our allies with the help from Iran. Mr. Ralby, do you believe it was wise to declassify the Houthis 2 years ago?
At the time, I did think it was the wise decision. The reason was At that point, there were two major equities at stake. Number one, the humanitarian situation in Yemen was absolutely dire. 6 million people were on the brink of famine, and the ability to negotiate the movement of aid with a foreign terrorist organization controlling the territory was one of the challenges that was being faced.
Thank you, and I thank you for the answer. I'm running out of time. I would respectively disagree with you. We are where we are now, and certainly look how that worked out for us. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Auchincloss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the witness's time and testimony. Dr. Ralby, despite their protestations, do you think the Houthi leadership cares about the people of Gaza?
No, I do not.
And is it true that, in fact, under their brutal, incompetent, nefarious governance, that 10 times as many people have died in Yemen as have died in Gaza?
I'm terrible at math, but sounds about right.
Yes. And so I would note for those in the United States and elsewhere who are cheering on these Houthi pirates who have designed to make them into social media stars, who are chanting, who are rallying to their flag, that they are supporting terrorists who have killed American service members, who have been sadistic to their own people, and who seek to undermine the very rules of international commerce that have allowed peace and prosperity to spread the world over. Do you think the Houthi leadership gains or is weakened with direct confrontation with the United States?
One important thing to note is that the Houthi leadership is a bit of an amorphous body. It is always intentionally decentralized. And so one of the challenges is that, yes, we could maybe look at who the Supreme Council is and determine them, but there are also other factions in different parts of the area that will respond differently. All of them, though, all of them are responding in the same way at the moment to the U.S. strikes. That it has emboldened all of them uniformly.
Yes. So to be blunt about it, this is good politics for them at home. Yeah. And so while I hear the outrage and the sense of urgency from my Republican colleagues, and viscerally I share it, anytime American merchant marine, anytime American service members are under harm's way, we also have to recognize that we don't want to walk in to the game that our enemy wants to play. So let's now unravel what might actually scare Houthi leadership. They are reliant on Iran as their patron state, is that correct?
They are.
And Iran itself is reliant on China as the purchaser of its oil exports, is that right?
They are.
So is it safe to say that China could exercise significant influence here if it wanted to reduce support and funding for the Houthi?
Very much so.
And yet, as a member of the Select Committee on Competition with the Chinese Communist Party, I want to highlight that China is not only missing in action as a purported upholder of international commerce and rules, but is in fact actively undermining the potential for a peaceful resolution to this issue. The deal that they brokered between, I use the word broker maybe in quotation marks because really it was a performance, but that they claimed to help broker between Saudi Arabia and Iran required that those states bring the Houthis under control. Obviously that hasn't happened, and yet China has done nothing to curtail or punish Iran for that. China has also done nothing to ensure the safety of the Red Sea, is that right?
That is correct.
What do you think should the response of the United States be to the Chinese Communist Party's complete unwillingness to be a responsible global citizen in this episode?
Well, first of all, I think it needs to be made clear that is a major factor. China has also a signed treaty by Xi Jinping himself with Ukraine not to stand in if anybody attacked them. They didn't do that. They are very good at not fulfilling their obligations when things get hot. And in this particular situation, they're probably a bit frustrated by the equities. They did host, I would say, that deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which complicated in some ways their position because they now have a vested interest in maintaining that détente, that rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis have very complicated equities with regard to the Houthis. So they're probably quite frustrated right now.
And their economy is the most trade dependent of any in the world.
Absolutely. So they're hurting, but they're actually probably enjoying watching us take the first set of hits for this. They are a looming question mark, and we need to call them out quickly.
Yet another example of the malign and malicious attempts at global leadership from the Chinese Communist Party. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Ezell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Houthi attacks that are targeting maritime vessels in the Red Sea represent a direct threat to maritime transportation and ultimately to the world's supply chains. The Trump administration recognized the threat posed by this group and took decisive action by designating the Houthi rebels as a global terrorist entity, which would allow the placement of crippling sanctions on these fighters. However, one of the Biden administration's first actions communicated a message of weakness as President Biden removed the Houthis from this designation. We are witnessing a clear trend. Past actions by President Biden continue to strengthen terrorist organizations and encourage global attacks. Dr. Rowley, it's clear we must put an end to this Houthi aggression. You mentioned in your testimony that the Houthis are often untrustworthy negotiators. Can you expand on how negotiations have gone in the past, and do you think anything has changed?
The Houthis not only are untrustworthy, they enjoy making whoever they're negotiating with look bad in the eyes of their people. They have a long history of agreeing to things and then reneging. I'll give one concrete example. The FSO Safar was a critically important issue to address off the coast of Yemen. It had 1.14 million barrels and would have not only caused a spill 4 times the size of Exxon Valdez, but would have actually taken out the desalination plants on which more than several tens of millions of people rely for their drinking water along the Red Sea. And the Houthis, in negotiating to do something about the vessel, continually agreed to an assessment mission, allowed for the UN to expend funds on placing that assessment team in Djibouti, and then reneged on it. And they enjoyed doing the same thing over and over again. And unfortunately, a lot of the negotiators who have tried to work with the Houthis have found themselves falling afoul of the definition of insanity, trying to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. The Houthis are consistent in one thing, in being untrustworthy, in being very quick to renege on any promises they make. So they cannot be trusted. They cannot be negotiated with in the same way that we would otherwise. Recently, they agreed to not attack vessels that were carrying oil coming into the Gulf of the Port of Aden. Unfortunately, they went ahead and struck them very quickly. So they have a long history of reneging on every promise they make.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Rouser, you're next. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my friend and colleague, Dusty Johnson here. Dusty and I serve as co-chairs of the Supply Chain Caucus here on the House side. And I know I have heard from industries all across the board, obviously, just how critically important the Red Sea and Suez Canal are to an efficient supply chain. Dr. Rabi, in your testimony, you state that while oil and gas shipments are being impacted, the greater threat is the shipment of specific goods with specific delivery times. You also mentioned that disrupting the 30% of global container traffic on the Red Sea will have a greater impact on the economy than the 10% of oil traffic. Can you speak a little bit more to these goods shipped through the Red Sea and what impacts delayed shipments have on the global economy and commerce? And then as a follow-up to that, Mr. Gold, I'd be curious your thoughts on the impact to consumer prices.
I'll be very quick. Energy supplies are fungible. Oil is oil. Yes, there are different categories of oil, but once the products have been refined, they can be replicated and supplanted by different shipments from all over the world. Goods, however, are targeted towards specific purchasers, and so you can't just make up for somebody's race car that is due to be at a specific race at a specific time by substituting another one. So there are a different set of equities for the container carriers versus the oil and gas industry and the wider energy industry. In fact, one of the other disparities is that oil and gas movements through the Red Sea are actually a much smaller percentage of the overall traffic than the container goods. And so that is why I would argue that the container industry, which is why it's important to have Mr. Dar here, is more affected by this.
Yeah, as a follow-up too, how much, let's just assume hypothetically that all trade is cut off there. How much of the U.S. economy is represented with that? What is that figure?
I do not have that figure. That is not my area of expertise. But what I can say is that it's not just the U.S. economy, it's global because of the nature of our globalized supply chains. And the important piece that I would also note that doesn't get looked at as much is that it is not just goods for sale. It is also humanitarian aid. And so there are other consequences to this that transcend just the marketplace and go as well to desperately needed aid, medical supplies, other things that need to get to places on time in order to make sure human life is protected.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts there from the panel? Mr. Gold, you want to talk about inflationary impact?
Sure. I mean, obviously, we saw what happened during the pandemic when supply chains were essentially shut down and the impact we saw on prices and costs and everything else. I think right now it's too early to tell what that impact is going to be because of what's happening in the Red Sea. I think as we talked about here, carriers and shippers will find a way to make product arrive. It might arrive later than you expected. You're going to have an impact on not just retailers, but manufacturers who are waiting on inputs to production, on ag products. You're already seeing the impact in Europe with ag products that are having to go around the Cape Good Hope that are having spoilage and having impact there. So I think, for my members, they're trying to contain costs as much as possible. So again, for the larger retailers, they're more nimble at being able to do that. For small and medium-sized companies, that's going to impact them more because they don't have that ability to negotiate on whether it's rates, surcharges, what have you. And again, it's not just on the rates that you're seeing in the surcharges, but it's the other impact on the congestion issues that we're going to witness if the surge does come and starts to clog up reports once again. You're going to see the additional charges from every mode of transportation throughout the supply chain as we witnessed during the pandemic. Hopefully we won't see the prices rise as much. That shouldn't be an issue. But again, it's way too early to tell what that economic impact is going to be. But we need to start paying attention now and working through those issues so we don't have congestion as we witnessed during the pandemic.
So what improvements do we need to make at our ports? What kind of alternative thinking, additional resources, what kind of opportunity does that present to us?
I think the biggest issue right now is, as we talked about earlier, we're making investments on the land side infrastructure, but we've got to work through some of the operational issues that really caused the congestion issues we saw during the pandemic. We've got to make sure all of the stakeholders, the carriers, terminals, drayage trucks, railroads, warehouses, the shippers are all talking to each other to understand what's happening at any point in time so that we don't have the congestion issues. Making sure we have equipment readily available, the chassis, the rail cars, are there when they need to be there and not cause further congestion.
Mr. Dart, it looked like you had something to say.
I did, thank you, sir. First of all, I'd like to say I agree with that interconnectivity that Mr. Gold just laid out. I think that's spot on, and I want to congratulate the Department of Transportation for initiating the flow process, which is a pretty good attempt to try and open up some more visibility with the hope that we can project forward patterns much better based on the past. And it's an example of a genuine public-private partnership that I think deserves some recognition. Also, I want to point out that when it comes to containerized goods, they're not all affected equally here. And the higher value that the goods are relative to their volume that goes into a container, the much less affected they are by excursions in price. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not seeing anywhere near the sort of price excursions in the open market that we did during the pandemic. And also keep in mind, the baseline of which we might say prices are higher or less, actually is a baseline which was at a very low point in the market, below pandemic levels. And in a lot of cases, like, for example, in exports of U.S. ag cargoes, a lot of those we were carrying at below our costs at the time. So it's not painting the full picture, just to look at an absolute pricing point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, though. Sorry to go over.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to pick up where Mr. Rouser ended. He does a great job helping to lead the supply chain caucus. And I think number one, we all get it. We understand that going through the Red Sea is an incredibly dangerous proposition these days. I think we all understand that some carriers would rightfully make a decision to reroute. I think we understand that those reroutes could cause price adjustments. Now, Mr. Gold, Mr. Dar, you've both made it clear the full effect of those really haven't been felt yet. We don't know what next month or the month after that holds. Of course, I have talked to some shippers who are a little concerned that these reroutes could create an opportunity for not just reasonable fee and rate adjustments, but perhaps unreasonable fee and rate adjustments, really with a process that doesn't have a tremendous amount of transparency. And so, Mr. Dar, what do you say to shippers who raise those concerns?
Well, I can say, first of all, get to know us better and have the kind of dialogues that we've had facilitated by some associations of ag exporters in particular, and we understand each other better. We can serve their needs better, set up groups to help accommodate that, even when times are good rather than the really challenging times like now. And I think if you've prepared and you've built the relationships in those times, it's much easier to deal with a crisis and you're speaking the same language. I also would encourage those that can to seek the stability of longer-term service agreements rather than just to be reliant upon the spot market, because those that are much more subject to market fluctuations. In the U.S., for example, 90% roughly of our cargoes in and out are carried under service agreements, and there's a significant advantage as far as stability goes with that. Lastly, I'll make the point about the need to mutually focus on things that can be of benefit. And for example, investments in the ports for densification purposes, which involves taking advantage of some technology that exists today, does not have to be at the expense of any port jobs. And as I said, our model, we try not to do that at all, but yet we can improve and do much better and reach higher efficiency levels similar to what we see in many overseas ports if we make those investments here and do so with the right goals in mind.
So with those associations that do have an active dialogue with you, you're not hearing those kind of concerns about maybe unreasonable rate increases to come?
No, sir, I'm not, because if they are unreasonable, we are in a very competitive marketplace. And even though right now the carriers are having to adapt very quickly and add capacity and add equipment and things into it, ultimately, the competition in the market is going to be a boundary on this. And I think as a case in point, Sea Intelligence, for example, just published their latest analysis over the last couple of business days, and they've shown that on the export side in the U.S. Trans-Pacific market, which is where most of the ag goes, those rates are actually about flat. So again, we're seeing the import side or the head haul carry most of the burden of the extra costs of having to adjust the networks. And in normal times, it's not uncommon to see 85 to 90% of the revenue actually generated on the import side, and the exporters benefit from that. That seems to be, according to the published data, one of the dynamics that's happening now. And if it gets too far out of bounds, the market will correct it. There will be somebody else that will carry the cargo that meets the shipper's needs.
Certainly a competitive market would respond in that way. I mean, and I don't know how you'd ultimately define a market that's not competitive enough. We have seen concentration in the industry in the last couple of decades. You'd know the numbers better than I would, but I think 70% of the cargo held by the largest 5 or 6 partnerships. But it is good to hear that the rates have been flat. Mr. Gold, what else would you say in response to Mr. Dar's comments?
I think certainly those that are under the yearly contract have better ability to negotiate on rate increases and surcharges. There certainly are provisions. But again, small and medium-sized companies that aren't under those yearly contracts that rely on the spot market don't have the same ability and same flexibility. And they certainly are the ones that are being impacted by those increases. And again, looking to the next contract cycle, concerns about what comes next and how those prices are, going to go forwards. Right now, we would love to see more visibility into how some of those numbers are coming about. I think from what I hear from my members, they are working with the carriers and negotiating and figuring out, how much of those surcharges they're going to take on. But they would love to get the exact understanding of, where those numbers are actually coming from to understand what's being, put forwards to them.
So as we look about problem solving and even doing a better job, Mr. Dar, I thought your suggestion about, hey, more engagement would be good. Sounds like additional transparency would be your addendum to that, Mr. Gold, right?
I think so, yes. And we're looking forward to the hearing the Federal Maritime Commission will be holding on February 7th on this specific issue.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, seeing there's no further testimony, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here and their very good testimony. Thank the members for being insightful. Thank the audience for being respectful. Hearing's adjourned.